sur Terre que sous l'eau aurait permis le développement du cerveau et une meilleure cognition. Dr. MacIver will focus on how sentience changed when fish climbed up on land 385 million years ago. The eyes became 3 times larger, the brain developed, allowing a better sentience cognition. Please welcome Dr. Malcolm MacIver.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction and for having me at this summer school. So I'm going to essentially talk about, just to give you a conceptual orientation to what follows, the change in feeling that you have between a doctor, doing the patellar tendon reflex by tapping your knee, that reflexive sort of, you've done something, your consciousness is still catching up with you, having done it potentially if you didn't know the hammer was about to go on your kneecap. So that sensation, you're reacting, versus you're sitting in your chair right now, either paying attention to me or maybe thinking about your plans for tomorrow, which are much more exciting than listening to me. And you're thinking, deliberating about, well, should I take the bike out in the evening so I can get away quickly or whatever. You're thinking about a plan for tomorrow. So that's a very deliberative sensation. It's not a reactive thing. The feeling you have is one of sort of expansive exploration of possibilities in your space, in your imagination. So that switch, I want to claim, is really a function of coming up onto land. So let's see if I can convince you that the change in feeling that you have, the difference in feeling you have between those two scenarios, came about because of the transition onto land. So here's a road you're traveling down, and let me get you're traveling down this road, and you've woken up late to get to your class, which has a final exam, and you are going inadvisably rapidly down this road. And so you're going, I don't know, maybe 80 kilometers an hour, something too high down this road, 50 miles an hour or so. And then you hear it, and it's your phone vibrating away down there on the console, and you do something even more inadvisable, and you look down at the screen of your phone. And then you look back up at the road, and there it is. All right. So you've got no time. You've got no time to do anything. Here's are things you don't do. You don't wait and see if the deer moves off your side of the road. You don't see if another car comes the other way, scaring the deer away. You don't honk your horn to intimidate the deer into getting out of your lane. And you don't send an angry tweet disparaging the intelligence of local deer. These are all things you don't do. Doesn't even enter into your awareness to try them. Things you do are brake and swerve. This is rather dim. I don't know if that's possible to fix. Swerve and brake. Brake, swerve, and emit an expletive. Or if you're me, just emit expletives. There's nothing you can do. Damn it, So this is kind of the scenario, right? Reaction. That's lights down. Yeah. So if there's a way to darken it, I don't know. We had a bunch of video issues earlier, so I don't know if this is part of that. So somewhere in the nervous system lives how much time you have, how long will it take for you to come up with and deploy a movement to fit the occasion, and the relationship between these two durations, all right? So animals are often on the move. So rather than time, I'm going to talk about space and assume a predator versus prey scenario, okay? And that takes care of a few technical things. We can discuss later how important the predator versus prey context is to the arguments. So the time an animal has before it should do something with respect to a predator or prey is proportional to how far away it is at the time of detection. That's kind of obvious. You've got a long distance to your predator, you've got a little bit more time than if it's right in front of your face and you've got to do an escape. So I'm going to call that the sensory volume. It might be a visually mediated sensory volume. It might be an auditory one. There's a bunch, any modality you want. Electrosense, my favorite. So the sensory volume is the outer limit of where a given object can be detected by a particular sensory system or combination of systems, okay? So, and I'm just gonna diagram it by this blue sphere or blue circle in front of an animal, but its shape and size and distribution around the animal is of course modality dependent. So this is just an abstraction and idealization. Okay, so the other concept I want you to know is from a given initial condition of an animal, be it stationary or if it's in full speed, however it locomotes, consider the boundary of all the places it can get to in a set time given any possible activation of its muscles. So you've got hundreds of muscles in your body. If I were to get you to activate those sequentially or in combination, there'd be some limit to how far you can go in a given amount of time. So as the time allowed increases, the boundary of reachable space expands and changes shape. And one intuitive place to think about that is this car here. So you know that with your car, you can go forward and backward, and you can only do lateral moves by, jiggering around with your steering wheel back and forth to do parallel parking. So the reachable set initially is kind of not homogeneous, with bigger spaces in front and back and smaller spaces on the side. But as you get further out in time, it gets more spherical because you can use your steering wheel to explore more parts of the space. Okay, so that's what I'm going to call the motor volume, and that's a function of time. Okay, obviously sensory systems, you're able to sense the information relatively quickly. We're not going to parameterize that with time, but with movement, certainly how far you get in a given delta t is a function of how much time. All right, so again, I'm going to show that as a round circle, this time green in front of the animal, but its distribution and shape changes as a function of what the animal is doing and initial conditions and how much time. But so the motor volume for a given time, the envelope of where the surface of the body can reach in a specified time. All right, so somewhere in the nervous system, instead of talking about how much time you have, I'm going to talk about the SV, or sensory volume. Instead of how long will it take to come up with and deploy a movement to fit the occasion, I'm going to talk about the MV. And then the body, to control its behavior, has to have a representation, I would argue, of the relationship between these two durations. Okay, so here's a case. What do you do when your sensory volume is smaller than where you're going to get to over your sensory motor delay time or your reaction time? So you can sort of think about this and just ask yourself, okay, so if I'm going so fast that I'm going to get to somewhere in space that I can't see currently over my reaction time, which for a human using vision is around 200 milliseconds, it's pretty predictable what's going to happen, right? This is going to happen, something like that. So that's collision mode. Now, suppose that the amount of space you're going to use up in your reaction time is roughly equal to the distance that you can sense, say with vision. So that's kind of the foggy road, driving in a foggy road with respect to some strange obstacle in the middle of the road. Okay, so now you see it, but you have just enough time to actually do something adaptive, such as swerve or steer or brake with respect to that object. And so I'm going to call that reactive mode. So the sensory volume and the motor volume are basically overlapping. And now here's the situation of us up on land using our long-range visual systems with high acuity. You sense way far beyond where you're immediately moving. So your sensory volume's over here, that tiny little green circle, where your your motor volume is that tiny green circle, where your sensing is the big blue thing. And whereas in the reactive mode, you could have reacted to sort of avoid this thing here. Now, with your enhanced ability to sense with respect to where you're moving, you're able to sense the obstacle way off in the distance and start thinking about, well, maybe I should start to slow down, or maybe I'll put my left turn ticker on so that I can avoid the obstacle. You start to think about these things. You have time to think about these things. So this is deliberation, right? And so I want to refer to this as the deliberative mode. Okay. So I want to dig a little deeper into the reactive mode and talk about sort of two different types of reactive modes, or at least a scale of it, where animals, can you see that okay? Have very inflexible but fast responses. So essentially, you can trigger an action such as hitting on your knee, and you get the same thing over and over and over again, and it's very fast. And if you give animals a little bit more time, it turns out that although the speed of the movement is roughly similar, there's a little bit of latency, and that latency is used by the nervous system out of your awareness to generate more variability of movement, okay? So, and that sort of is a spectrum of behavioral urgency from high to low. So predator right in front of your nose versus predator maybe a couple of arms length away, but you have just enough time to do a little bit more variability. So here's an example. Okay, so that situation diagrammatically, just to go back to our schematization, the sensory volume slightly larger than the motor volume, but not by much in the sort of reactive mode A, we'll call it. And then if you have a tiny bit more space than to sense over than where you're moving immediately into, you have a bit more space to play with. So here's an example, right? So get some warm fuzzies for the wonderful George Bush, that former president of the United States, here being attacked by a shoe by somebody in the audience while speaking with Nouri al-Maliki. And here's the thing about this action, right? The ducking action, we've all done it when something was thrown at us. It's fast and inflexible. And to see that, you can sort of see if Nouri al-Maliki had been in cahoots with the shoe thrower, he could have put a pie there, and you would have ended up with a pied George Bush as a result. You just cannot plan where you're going to duck when you have to do it really quickly. Now, this is not just a theoretical possibility. There are animals that make their living this way in a certain sense. So this is a tentacled snake. And tentacled snakes have learned how to hack the fast but inflexible nervous system of their prey, their favorite prey, which are fish. And what they do, it's really tricky, and it's hard to see. I'll show you a high-speed video that Ken Catania has done a lot of work on this animal. What he's shown is that they send a very small wave of contraction from tail to head. And the fast but inflexible escape system of fish causes a certain response of the fish, which you might be able to predict. Certainly the tentacled snake can. So let's see what that is. So it's high-speed video. If you look carefully at this part of the video, you might start, you'll see a little wriggle, but it's very subtle. So great. Such a fast and inflexible response that the snake knows exactly where to position its open mouth as a result of this is occurring over a very small amount of time, I think 10 milliseconds or so. So this is an incredibly high-speed action. Now, as an example of a more delayed, more variable, but delayed response, I give you this classic cinematic piece, Austin Powers. So what's funny about this is that, it's obvious what's funny about this. But so you get more variable but delayed responses. So here's the plan for the rest of the talk. I'm going to dig a little bit into the weeds of the reactive mode, tell you about some neuroscience we've done in the lab, digging into the hindbrain circuitry that mediates fast responses, and how that fractionates into one type of high-speed response that depends on a very specialized circuit, and another type of high-speed response that does not depend on this high-speed circuit. And then talk about what happens when we get up onto land and in terms of being able to process things in different ways. So the reactive mode is key in fish. They escaped it by bringing their eyes above water, and what they saw led to the invasion of land 380 million years ago. And I'm going to claim, and I'm going to argue with some data, that the sensory physics and complexity of land selects for planning. It's the thing that allowed you to go from that reactive, got to do something feeling to let me think about it. So the neuroscience we've done in the lab is with this creature. It's a larval zebrafish. It's a total of 4 millimeters long when we do our work with it. Let me show you the apparatus that we use for exploring reactivity. So it's one way to elicit a high-speed reactive response is to show a looming stimulus. In this case, we have the animal is sitting in a tiny petri dish and is watching a movie projected onto the edge of a larger dish that is sitting outside. And on that movie screen, it sees a series of images, okay? And basically, it's a looming black, a looming black object, okay? And what this causes is a very predictable response in the fish, which is to escape. It sees this thing, it thinks it's a predator. In fact, we adjust parameters so that the looming size, initial size and final size is roughly similar to things that prey on larval zebrafish, which happen to be bigger zebrafish, one of its predators. They eat their young. So here's an escape response. Right there. Happens very quickly. A little bit on, I won't go into exactly how we parameterize a stimulus. Here's some snapshots of the behavior just for a sense of temporal scale. 4 milliseconds after the initial point, and then it goes on. It happens very, very rapidly. We get an escape where the animal, in this case, is turning, initially a little more than 90 degrees and ends up at a heading, I don't know, around 90 degrees from initial heading. So what we found behaviorally is the following. So we applied these looming stimuli to the fish at a whole bunch of different speeds. When we applied, we're going to categorize it into 2 different categories of stimuli: fast approach and slow approach. And when we applied, when we gave the animal the fast stimuli, we saw the responses on this polar plot. So we're just plotting here what its final heading was. And the arrow at top there shows you the direction that the loom was coming from, okay? So here it's facing, the head is facing upwards. The looming stimulus comes in from the front and it goes 180 degrees most of the time, somewhere around 180 degrees with that spread as a response to the stimulus. And from the right, same sort of pattern, but in a different quadrant. And from the left, same sort of pattern, but in a different quadrant. All right. When we go to slower approaches, and it's still very fast, but slower, we get more variable responses, quite a bit more variable. This takes 300 milliseconds more for the animal to come up with. The response is equally fast, but it takes a 300 millisecond delay for the animal to program this amount of variability. So what you see here is that there's a trade-off between I can go really fast and be so predictable that there are things like the tentacled snake, which just know how to hack my nervous system and elicit a reactive predictive response. Or if I can just take 300 milliseconds more, I can get a more variable response, which a predator wouldn't be able to predict, okay, or less predictable. And it turns out what we've shown is that there's a cell in the brain of fish, which has been known for, it's been studied heavily for decades. It's called the Modner cell. Here's a blurry, very blurry image of it with calcium indicators on it, loaded into it. There's one on the right and one on the left. So it's this one right here and this one right here. These cells, these Modner cells, do nothing but enable the animal to escape from a stimulus with a few more milliseconds than if the Modner cell isn't active. So it's really a dedicated high-speed reactivity system. And what we've done is we've monitored from above a whole bunch of, we're using, I'm not going to go into too many details, but we use light field techniques to image an entire volume of cells, of which this is just a small part. And we load them up with calcium using, and have a calcium indicator in them. And we've neuronally expressed GCAMP in them. And then from below, so from above, we're monitoring activity on a single cell level. The animal is embedded, partially embedded in a little bit of jello here, but its head is exposed to look at the screen and its tail is fully exposed. So that's shown down here. And what we can do is we can tell from the movement of the tail what the animal would have done if it had been freely swimming, so where it would have gone to. So I'll just show you one trial of this behavior. So you're going to see this square getting larger, and then notice that this cell at some point gets brighter. And this is a high-speed video, so it's going slower than it actually. Okay, so there was the pulse of brightness, and there was the escape response. And we're able to sort of look at, okay, what is the neural circuitry, what neural circuitry is happening with the high-speed responses and the slow speed. And what happens with the high-speed responses, in short, is that usually, but not always, the Modner cell gets recruited. And with the slow speed, higher variability responses, a non-Modner circuit is recruited. And we've explored some of the dynamics of that. What's the ultimate utility? I've already alluded to it. Here's another example. If you take a bunch of these animals and you ablate, you use a laser to kill the Modner cell. One of the predators of the larval zebrafish are dragonfly nymphs. These guys are fearsome creatures. They will, attack your finger if you put it into the dish. They're really quite aggressive. So if you do that experiment, if they don't have their Modner cell, there's a lot fewer of the fish in the petri dish at the end of the experiment than if they have their Modner cell. So this has real ethological implications, this high-speed reactivity network. It's really important. So I'm going to shift gears now. We'll allude back to these results in a few different places later in the talk, but I want to switch gears now and talk about signals, visual signals in water versus air. So it's a bit of a transition, but you'll see how it fits later, I hope. If you don't, please ask questions. And by the way, please ask questions if anything is unclear. We don't have to wait to the end. So we did a bunch of analysis of what happens with visual signals in water versus air. This was published this past year. And the short story, the short version of the story is, if you look at something ethologically relevant in size, a 10 centimeter black disk in this case in full sun, and you look at the distance that it can be detected as a function of eye size through water in orange and through air, through air in green, you see there's this massive disparity. This is essentially, water is a terrible conductor of light. It just is a wet blanket on light, as it were. And what's also interesting is that as a function of eye size, you get almost no bang for your buck in terms of how much visual range you get. So this is 4.4 meters. With quite a small eye, you get 4 meters of detectability. What's 4 meters? So the animals that led to us, our best guess, Euthanopteran, Tiktaalik, this group of animals from 380 million years ago, they were order meter to 2 meters long. We expect they moved a body length or 2 per second. So at 4 meters, with the eyes that they had, which were smaller, they're essentially seeing brand new things every body length or 2. So it's essentially reactive mode. And that, it's important to point out, is kind of a function of the sensory physics of light in water, not really of the nervous system. You can't get better, even with a giant eye. And giant eyes are, by the way, very expensive. So you don't evolve them unless there's a utility to it, essentially. And if you put an animal with an eye like a blind cavefish, or the seen morph of the blind cavefish into caves, they will lose their eyes over a few generations because they're just metabolically expensive. Oops. All right, so as the eye size increases, in the air case though, you get this giant increase in range, okay? So, this insight led us to wonder what happened to the eyes. Yes? Yeah, absolutely. So they're both of them in the same sort of, they're just seeing a whole new world every body length or 2. Absolutely. But they're both in reactive mode. That's, yeah. So, right. Is it any other questions as I'm paused here? Okay. So that result led us to ask the question of what happened to eyes when animals came up on land almost 400 million years ago. Interestingly, all the paleontologists and paleobiologists who are interested in early tetrapods focused on the limbs. And, with good reason. If you ask yourself, what's the most important body part for getting up on land? You'd probably say, well, probably limbs, right? I mean, doesn't that make sense? Well, we wanted to take a look at what was going on there. And interestingly, the paleontologists basically had told me that, oh, the eyes got larger, and there were a few offhand comments about this in their papers, but they hadn't even bothered to measure on the skulls that they took decades to find. They hadn't bothered to measure and plot how the size of the eye changed. So we had some relatively simple sort of work to do, which was retrieve the specimens or images of the specimens published in papers. Here's one beautiful specimen, Gorgonosus from Australia, 385 million years old, fin tetrapod. And we measured the length of their orbits, and we measured the length of their skull. So we took 60 different taxa. This is just one of 60. Measured the orbit, here in this case 7 millimeters, and their skull length. And we did that for the 60 taxa that were part of our data set. And here's what we found after we assembled all the data. The dot size are residuals of the unexpected change in eye size after you subtract out just the effect of a change in body size. So those dots basically indicate eye size corrected for body size. And you can see a clear trend from our fish, fully finned ancestors. Then there's a jump up to bigger eyes as we transition onto land, and then they get pretty large, essentially. And there's one interesting subgroup that returned to water and went back to small eyes, this group here. So if we just look at the total length of this eye socket, which is you can do a direct calculation for the size of the eye and then the size of the pupil and then the visual range that it most probably had. So I'm sort of, but using eye socket as a proxy for all that, it triples between the finned animals and the digited animals that became us. So in that very short transition from water to land, there's a tripling of orbit size and therefore eye size. Now, what was somewhat devastating, though, is that, so I had predicted that the eye size change would occur once we're on land because I showed you all this data that eye size gives you some benefit once you're on land. But we saw this. We saw a transition to larger eye sizes in these three taxa, Panderichthys, Tiktaalik, and Ichthyostega. These guys are known by paleobiologists or suspected with reasonably high confidence as having been primarily aquatic. So what's going on? They're tripling their eye size. They're primarily aquatic. For example, Tiktaalik has no rib cage. If you're going to be on land for a long period of time without a rib cage, you squish your internal organs. So you need a rib cage. But it doesn't have one. And its limbs are, they have a humerus and a radius and are limbs just like ours, but their digits are not yet separated. They're still webbed. So there's a bunch of things, and it's got a pretty significant tail, etc. So there's a bunch of indicators that it was primarily aquatic. So why would you triple your eyes and still be primarily aquatic? Well, unlikely that you're tripling your eye size for the benefit of seeing through water. It just doesn't get you much. But what we noticed is that between the smallest of the eye sizes and the proper, what we think of as just fish, with the laterally positioned small eyes, and these guys here, there's a switch to the top of the head on these raised bony prominences, eyebrows essentially. So there's a dorsalization. The eyes move from the sides of the head to the top of the head on raised ridges. Same thing with the later taxa. So what seems to be happening is that we've gone from an animal that does this sort of thing, hunts through the water column with a small cone of vision forwardly projected right here, to a case where essentially we're hunting something like crocodiles. But you might ask yourself, why would we hunt like crocodiles when there's nothing on land yet? These are the vertebrates that came to land. And the answer is that invertebrates, those clever little invertebrates, beat us onto land by 50 million years. So there's good evidence in the fossil record that things like millipedes and a bunch of other insects, some of which are now extinct, were crawling all over the land for 50 million years prior to vertebrates coming onto land. And so you can imagine, possibly because of lots of really mean-looking predators that these early tetrapods were exposed to, that they might have started going inland to estuaries and rivers and started hunting these invertebrates based on sort of coming up to the water's surface and looking out over the water's surface. So they're using aerial vision while still being primarily aquatic, but it's not a problem if you're an aquatic animal to come up onto land for a brief amount of time. It's just staying out there that's the problem. And then we find, finally, not too long after that in the fossil record, we have our first fully, what seems to be an animal that spent at least a lot of time on land, the first digited animal, separated digits. This is Ichthyostega, a 3D rendering we made of Ichthyostega. So getting more time to decide, what are the affordances of aerial versus aquatic visual sensory ecology? I've already told you a bunch of that. Let me now revisit now, but as I lead up to some data that we have collected to address what happened. So here we are on land. We have this circuit, which is a modification, but not So interestingly, the Modner circuit disappears, but we have startle circuits, and that mediates fast reactive behavior in us. And then we have in mammals, and it seems in a lot of birds, planned deliberative behavior, where you can look at something and sort of act in accordance to your model of that something that you are then planning to attack. So essentially, this is planned deliberative behavior. So here's a quote I really love from Ed Reed from a book he published in '96. He said, "It's not the animal's brain that organizes its world, but the evolutionary ecology of the animal that organizes its brain." And so I want to show you some bits of evidence toward sort of a claim that Ed Reed is correct, and that helps us understand what happened between fish and tetrapods on land. And the first bit of evidence I've already alluded to is that there was a loss. That high-speed system that give fish this little bit of a few milliseconds of advantage in water is completely gone. It's in amphibians, but not in reptiles and not in mammals, not in birds. It's completely gone. No trace, not clear what happened to it. But you can imagine once you're on land, the few milliseconds of advantage that circuit gives you, it's a whole dedicated circuit and giant neuron, would have been marginal at best. So this is perhaps the reason why that circuit disappears. This is really dim. The rats are trained. So another data point is some work that Johnson and Reddish published 2007 on some work they did with rats on a behavior called vicarious trial and error. Vicarious trial and error is a behavior where a rat will come to a choice point and pause and seemingly do nothing for a while. Okay, that's what vicarious trial and error designates from Tolman's work a few decades before. He's the person who first noticed it. So in this case, for their experiments, the rats are trained on a maze, and they learn the structure of the maze. And there's two potential reward sites, down here and down here on a different arm of the maze. Their start point is in the middle, and they get an auditory cue, and then they have to make a decision here about which way down the maze to go. So they switch the location of the reward, so the animal can't just learn to, at the choice point, go left to get the reward. They can't learn that. So what this shows, let me pause it, or I'll replay it, is a reconstruction of where the animal is thinking about in terms of space as a function of place cell activation in the hippocampus. So you can record a bunch of place cells in the hippocampus and reconstruct where in space you're thinking about based on the activations of those place cells. So they did that with the rat. And let me show you the video again now that you know that. So the rat is the white circle, and where it's thinking about in space is the heat map reconstructing position based on place cell activation. All right, so it pauses there at the choice point, and it essentially thinks about the two arms of the maze before making its choice. It's a noisy signal, but it's clear that that's what it's doing at that choice point. They have a bunch of other videos as well. So there seems to be a neural trace of what we think of as spatial deliberation. Why would you bother? Why would you bother with spatial deliberation? So what exactly computationally is it about life above water that is favoring planning? So we have a couple hypotheses we want to test. The first one, we say, what the planning and sensory range for sentient targets? Is there an interrelationship between planning and sensory range? So in other words, is it just the case that once you have a larger sensing range, suppose you could get it in water somehow, maybe using sonar, would that favor the selection of neural circuits for deliberation? So that's one hypothesis. So with respect to sentient targets, predators or prey, if planning is only advantageous given adequate time and information, then planning would confer a selective advantage for animals with large sensing range, but not for animals with short sensing range. It's a little bit tough to test empirically. One problem is that the animals that do these sorts of behaviors have evolved these circuits many millions of years ago, and we don't know, we can't tell from the fossil record what changes in the brain occurred to accommodate that and why they occurred. We can get some limited information from extant mammals and birds, but we opted for a computational approach where we try to test this hypothesis computationally. So how do we do it? We do it by representing what animals, a predator and prey, do in a very simplified grid world as a series of decisions, which is represented as something called a Markov decision process, or MDP. So what happens when you represent the world as an MDP? Here is a very simple maze, or, well, structure, I suppose you could call it. Start location is down here. You've got a couple branches. Your start position, your start state is S naught. You could turn right and go to S1. You could go to S2, which is kind of midway in the maze. You could go to S3, which is another terminal point, or you could go to S4, which is not only a terminal point, but it's a terminal point with a reward, okay? So with no reward is S1 and S3, and S2 and S naught are just kind of start location and a mid location. So we discretize the world in a series of discrete states, 5 states with 3 terminal states that provide no reward, or 3 that provide no reward or reward. And from the non-terminal states, there are 2 actions. You can enter the hall, or you can press a lever to open up a gate, okay? Until the terminal states, the agent does not know if it has received a positive or a negative or otherwise no reward. All right, so we're going to represent this as a Markov decision tree. And this is just to illustrate how one translates this kind of complex behavioral scheme into an abstraction that we can start to do some computation over. So here it is. So this is a Markov decision tree search problem where we have your initial state, and you've got a couple options at that initial state. You can enter hall, go to S1, but there's no reward there. You can go to S2, which is this intermediate step, and press a lever and go to S4, open the gate, get the reward +1, or you can turn right. Sorry. Or you can turn right and go to S3 and get no reward as well. So that's all it is. Translate, discretize the decision making problem into series of states and represent the terminal rewards. And now the animal is essentially having, the algorithm can turn away on this as a tree and use reinforcement learning algorithms to figure out which of these states or which decisions, which actions it should do at each state in order to maximize the reward. So learning can occur in a bunch of different time scales. I want to sort of go through in some detail what I mean by learning and planning and what the computational analogs of those 2 big terms in psychology are. So learning can occur, we typically think of it as plasticity within an organism's lifetime, even within much shorter time spans. Here's an example of phylogenetic time scale, so across the organism's lifetimes, which would select for circuits that would do the right thing. So not what you'd normally think of as learning, but sort of in the evolutionary frame, plasticity to the environment's contingencies. So here's a predator down here. Here's a prey, and it's faced with a decision of which way does it go to maximize its chances of getting to that prey. So it could do this, but it's kind of obvious that I mean, this being on land, the prey also has very long range vision. It sees the predator coming from a long way off, and so you get failure. Another approach would be to scoot around and go through this puddle. There's a certain problem with that is you disclose your position pretty early to the sensitive auditory apparatus of these animals, of your prey. So that also leads to failure. So if you do this, if you kept doing this kind of sequence of decisions when faced with this stimulus array for getting your food, you'll eventually die. You'll be filtered out. But circuits, if there happens to be some random mutation, or I mean, you can come up with your favorite way to implement this thing genetically. Maybe it comes across this scene in this exact orientation many times just because of the bizarre habitat it lives in. So the mutation that causes this leg to be a little bit shorter than that leg, and so causes it to veer that way in this configuration, might be selected for, and eventually you have a population of animals that do this, which is an ambush attack around these bushes with no sound occurring from splashing, and the prey doesn't know what's happening until it's too late, essentially. All right, so that would be an example of phylogenetic time adaptation or learning success. All right, so the severe punishment of wrong actions that are irreversible, and what do I mean by irreversible? Well, not just going hungry, that's reversible, but dying is irreversible, can prevent learning within the organism's life. That's ontogenetic time, the lifetime of the organism. However, certain actions that are good across multiple environments and starting conditions can result in neural circuits and genes being selected for, which is essentially learning in phylogenetic time. In other words, possibly something like the Modner circuit came about, the Modner cell and circuit, for a few more milliseconds of escape time came about, perhaps through such a sequence of events. But learning in ontogenetic time within the organism's time, which is the kind of learning we're much more familiar with and like to think about, that can occur in two different forms. One is the habit system. You gain these habits over thousands and thousands of trials that you do, and you learn to brush your teeth, etc., in a way that doesn't require a whole lot of forethought and can be done somewhat automatically. We'll call that, following the literature's conventions, that's usually referred to as model-free learning. And then another form of plasticity or behavioral control, planning or deliberation, is referred to as model-based, at least in the computationally oriented learning literature that we use in this work. So model-based versus model-free learning. I want to go into that in a little bit of detail because this is somewhat crucial for the approach we're using. So consider a maze with 3 arms of various lengths. So there's a short arm, there's a medium length arm, and then there's a long arm, right? At the end is food and a +20 reward. And in the case of model-based learning, what the agent is learning is actually an explicit representation of the structure, of the topology of this maze. It's actually getting a spatial representation of the maze. In the case of model-free learning, the agent learns not the structure of the space, but rather what happens as a function of actions. If I go left, I get this kind of reward. If I go straight, I get this kind of reward. If I go right, I get this kind of reward. And in this case, the rewards are proportional to the rapidity with which you get to the food, which is an additional reward. 10 minutes, okay. And so in the model-free learning case, the agent learns the relative rewards that it can get in these 3 cases. And so you can sort of schematize that as, rather than a representation of the maze, which was what was in the mind of this animal before, you have left is 0, right, forward is +10, and right is +5. So what happens with model-based learning under perturbations of this maze? In this case, the perturbation is we block it. We're going to block the maze here. So now the representation in the animal's brain is, okay, this whole route is now gone. So I've got, probably I should go back and do the green route. That's the next longest. So it goes back and it does that. And in the model-based case, if we put the blockage right here, what happens? Well, now this blockage is occurring after the join of that second longest arm of the maze, and it realizes that both of these trajectories are no longer feasible. So it goes back and it does this one without having to go back and go try the medium length one, which would at least get it to the barrier, but it wouldn't get it any further than that. All right. So that's what happens with model-based. With model-free, you get the barrier, and it goes, oh, well, the forward direction of +10 doesn't work, so I'm going to turn right because that's the next highest reward, not realizing that that also isn't going to work. All right, that's the model-free. And so it has to try and try again until it gets eventually the reward through the one avenue left. So model-based builds an action outcome model, probabilities to inform behavior. Therefore, agents' action choices are sensitive to outcome devaluation. This type of control enables planning. Model-free builds a reward model without keeping track of action outcome probabilities. These strategies lead to repeat choices that resulted in reward regardless of devaluation. It takes a long time for distal rewards to propagate to the start when reward values are changed under this type of control. And this is what we find in animals too. It takes many, many trials for animals to learn final reward contingencies and propagate that back. And if you change it, so you no longer get the reward in a habit with a habit, the animal continues to do the action even though it's been devalued. In model-based, with model-based though, you can, the first time the animal doesn't get the reward, it stops doing it, or at least it does it with much lower probability. And so that's been shown with psychological tests. In this case of, I think this was from rats, this might be humans. I need to go check that, but in any case, with the model-free control, after devaluation, the response rate is pretty much the same or not statistically different from the non-devalued case, but with model-based control, there is a change, a decrease in the response rate. All right, so with planning, what's happening is rather than do real actions in the world, you are deliberating over action outcome probabilities. So you are thinking about this situation. You're going, okay, if I go straight, well, the prey is going to see me. So maybe I should try this other way on the right. But oh, that's water. I know every time I go through water, I make noise. Maybe the animal will hear me. Better not do that. So I'll think about this way, and that's the route I'll take. That is planning requiring you to imagine scenarios and associate these action outcome pairs that you've learned in the past. So based on model-based learning, the predator relies on its action outcome model, which encompasses both the environment and the prey. In imagination, by playing out different scenarios multiple times, the predator can determine which action sequence would be the best without consequence. In environments which have irreversible consequences, trying out actions and imaginations helps the agent make an informed decision. By playing out multiple configurations and action choices, the predator is able to decide on one that would yield the most reward. And after each real action execution, this process is repeated. So you make one step. You don't just necessarily go through with your whole plan from start to finish after you make your plan. You take a step, you think about it, you look, has things changed? Has the prey moved? Oh, if it has, maybe I can't ambush anymore. Maybe I have to change my trajectory. So you replan, all right? So replanning is really crucial. So we tested this now with a Markov decision process model in a grid world, which is very small because the computations underlying it are pretty intensive. And what we did, we again want to test this hypothesis. Can you show that planning is selected for with larger visual ranges? So what we did was the prey has to get to this goal position without being eaten by this predator that can go 1.5 times as fast as the prey, and the prey has a variety of different sensory volumes. In the first case we ran, it only can sense out 1 grid square ahead of its current position. And then we tested other ranges, okay? So this is kind of, the short range is kind of the cloudy world, and then longer range, you see more, okay? So we tested this using reinforcement learning and a partially observable Markov decision process. And the representation is here. Here's the agent, the prey. Here's its sensory volume in the forward direction of its movement. Are the green squares are where it can sense. So if the predator is outside of this green square area, it doesn't know it's coming. All right. And here's what we find. So if you have short visual ranges, you quickly get eaten, unsurprisingly. With medium length, slightly longer range, oh, I had the sequence a little messed up. So this is visual range 1. You get eaten typically. Visual range 3, the predator intersects with your volume, your sensory volume at some point, and you run away to the other side of the maze and try to get to the goal point. So what we find, if we plot survival rate on the y-axis against simulation depth, just think of simulation depth as planning depth. How far into the future, how many steps are you planning into the future? What we find is, as a function of simulation depth or planning depth, your survivability goes up in this world. The control case is this top line, which is you can sense everything in the world. You don't have any limit to your sensory range. What we find is there's no significant difference in survival rate until depth of 100. At low planning levels and low sensory ranges with low planning levels, there's no difference in survival. As you plan more, you survive a little bit more with longer sensing ranges. And then as you plan more and more, the advantage of visual range 3 over visual range 2 and 1 increases, okay? So planning gets you a little bit, not a whole lot. This is not super impressive. So hypothesis 1 seems partially corroborated that planning has no benefit in reactive scenarios, but has progressively more benefit with sensing range. So reactive scenarios where sensing range is really short. All right, so, but we know from this example that the structure of the environment has a big role to play here. What the grid world that I just showed you has no obstacles in it. But here, this thought experiment I gave you before, which was tailored to be somewhat naturalistic, is using all kinds of structure in the world to game the system, if you will, or to gain advantage. So how do we put that into our model? So what we do is we go to this new hypothesis. Planning becomes significantly more advantageous for animals with long sensory ranges when the environment is more complex. Okay, so that's this case of the cheetah coming up stealthily on the antelope. So what we do is we put obstacles in our grid worlds now, and we control the density of obstacles according to the entropy of the world, which I can go into later if interesting. But essentially, you can, as sort of informally, entropy is level of disorder. So the higher the entropy, the more obstacles in the world. And so what we find, if you take a look at this video, is that the prey is being chased by the yellow predator and is using the occlusions, which block the predator's view, to sort of go around and hide from the predator to get so that the prey can get to the goal position. Here's another example with slightly more obstacles in the environment. So now the prey is using the obstacle as a waiting point and sort of jittering around there until it knows it can escape with enough advance time that the predator can't catch up. So it does have a model of the predator that it's learning. And then with even higher entropy, you sort of start to go back to there's only one solution to go to because it's so cluttered. I'm going to skip over this in the sake of time. Yes. So what we find is that as the entropy goes up, initially the complexity is very low of the world because there's no obstacles with low entropy. At medium entropy, sort of like this cream getting mixed in this coffee, there's all kinds of interesting structure at the interface. And then at high entropy, which is the super occluded world, there's again low complexity because now it's sort of a jungle and your sensory ability, your use of sensing range to plan over is again frustrated. Okay, and we can see that by these frequency of occupation heat maps. The take-home message is that at low entropies, there's a few escape paths. As you increase the entropy, there's a bunch of potentially successful escape paths. And it's this situation that favors planning and replanning as a function of the contingencies of where the predator is. Okay, and then as you get to higher entropy, there's again just a few select paths to go down. All right. And what we find is that now, as a function of entropy of the world, survival rate goes up, and now it's quite considerable as a function of simulation depth. There's quite a big advantage to planning more, and it goes up and it peaks at about 0.6, and then it decreases after that. So as you get to the jungle condition where planning is again frustrated, you're essentially, again, a reactive animal, and you go back to low survival rate as a function of the planning depth. Okay. All right. A couple points I want to make on that, and then show you a quick video, and then I'll be a little bit over. So when entropy is 0, non-included world, there's no benefit in increasing planning depth from 1,000 to 5,000. Planning just provides the agent with 2 paths, essentially. As entropy increases, the incremental benefit of planning also increases. There is now a significant difference in survival rate between depth 1,000 and 5,000. And planning now leads to discovery of these diffuse survival paths. At very high entropy, survival rate becomes more dependent on predator and environment initialization. Now, here's now those calculations, the planning calculations are pretty intensive. It's a hard thing to do. And it's interesting that the land animals if you look at body masses over 100 grams, which is a pretty small animal, the minimum increase in brain size between that and fishes, reptiles, and amphibians is a factor of 10, and then it goes up to a factor of 40 as you get to larger brain sizes. So, some part of the brain increase, I think, is going towards supporting the rather intensive calculations that have to go into planning and deliberation. So, summing up, escaping the water enabled a massive expansion in visual range. This increased the time available for decision making, but how does this lead to planning? Hypothesis 1 was that planning and sensory range may be coupled, and that computational work showed that there's no benefit in planning when the prey visual range is short. In a simple world with entropy 0, no obstacles, survival rate is only modestly increased for prey with longer visual range. Hypothesis 2, planning and habitat complexity. We looked at the relationship between planning depth and entropy. At mid-range entropy, an increase in planning depth greatly increases survival rate. We conclude that higher planning depths are important for environments that do not have inherent regularities. So we think the computational work is providing a pretty strong signal that the complexity of land in combination with the sensory physics of light on land support or select for moving away, or at least adding to our basal sort of reactive brain that deals with stimuli at short ranges and gives you very fast but pre-programmed responses, and selects for a system wherein you have to have a scratch pad of imagination, the hippocampus, medial forebrain areas, where you simulate, internally you simulate, think about futures, and then select the best future from the imagination system that you've evolved. So I'll leave you with this and then a 3-minute video. Consciousness is the operation of the plan executing mechanism, enabling behavior to be driven by plans rather than immediate environmental contingencies. So in Bridgman's eyes, at least, being able to be decoupled from sensory inflow and having to react to that sensory inflow, which I argue is a function of your environment and sensory range, is really what opens up the possibility of having a space for consciousness. Not everything we mean by consciousness is captured by that definition, but I think it's a good operationalization for consideration in scientific work. All right, I'm going to show you a video that sort of summarizes this work and gestures to sort of more cognitive and cultural things at the end. So this is a collaboration between myself and a filmmaker, 3-minute long animation.
Almost 400 million years ago, some adventurous fish made a huge leap that eventually led to the evolution of humankind. They decided to come up on land. We humans probably would never have evolved the intelligence we have today if not for that move onto land. Why? Because it vastly improved our eyesight. According to neuroscientist MacIver, the way we think about the world is closely tied to what we can see. And fish can't see a whole heck of a lot. That's mainly because light doesn't travel very far in the water. Our ancient fish ancestors lived their lives in constant fog, so that their brains evolved to react quickly to whatever suddenly appeared on the horizon. MacIver had a theory that the move to land expanded our aquatic ancestors' vision, and in turn, their brains. To test his theory, he and paleontologist Lars Schmitz spent a year running simulations with fossil data. Their research revealed new clues about why fish came onto land in the first place. It all seems to have started when the first fish peeked above the water's surface. Suddenly it was able to see 70 times further, and behold, a smorgasbord of tasty land dwellers. To capitalize on this discovery, the fish would have to evolve. Its eyes soon moved to the top of its head and tripled in size, and its fins began evolving into limbs so that it could stalk its new prey like a crocodile. Hunting on land was a mental game changer for the early tetrapods. Their total sensory volume increased 1 millionfold, giving them a much bigger window into the future. The first animal that figured out how to plan accordingly instead of just reacting would have had a huge evolutionary advantage. Iterate that kind of natural selection 1 million times, and eventually we have something called prospective cognition. That's our ability to weigh different options for the future and choose strategically. To this day, fish have not evolved those kinds of complex planning skills, but many land animals have. Understanding the evolutionary roots of intelligence helps explain how humans got so smart, but also why we are so dumb. We've evolved to deal with the things we can see in the here and now. We still don't plan well for things that are too far away in time or space. Will our vision ever evolve so that we can see the faraway consequences of our actions more clearly? Evolution won't make that happen anytime soon. But understanding the relationship between vision and planning may help us engineer solutions, like using technology to bring faraway things closer. That just might give us the evolutionary advantage we need to survive the next 400 million years.
All right, so with that, I'll take any questions.
it off. We have a few sessions. I don't know how long you're staying, Malcolm, but there'll be a few sessions that will be giving, let's say, supplements to what you're saying. Jonathan Balcom is definitely going to challenge your low view of fish cognition. And there's going to be more also on the evolution of planning and things like that.
Yeah.
What is your
Saturday evening is when I stay till. So I want to mention one thing about fish cognition, because I do believe in fish cognition. So this is with respect to predator-prey interactions. So the point is that you have a mobile target that is only appearing very late. It's not with respect to things like home, with respect to things like stable environmental features like my favorite food source or favorite hunting grounds. There's no problem for fish to do cognition, and they do. They have a dorsal pallium that is the thing that seems to be ancestral to hippocampus. So absolutely, the thing is that with respect to mobile dynamic contingencies such as predator or prey, if you have limited sensing range, your ability to plan for such objects, which are fitness-wise probably the most important objects, or some of the most important objects, is very, very constrained. So I do want to make sure that people understand I'm not suggesting that fish can only do reactivity. I'm saying with respect to sentient targets of opportunity, be they opportunities that are good or harms, there's very little one can do when sensory physics limits your range to very short distances. Yeah.
Hi, it was a really interesting talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
I was thinking naturally, I think everyone trying to think of counterexamples to the case you're making. And I thought of really exceptional deliberative stalking predators in fish like arowana and archerfish. Do you think they have all those capacities under specific ecological constraints that don't apply to most marine fish or other fish? Or do you think they kind of overcame these sensory system barriers that other fish did not in other ways?
Yeah, I'm familiar more with the archerfish and arowana case. I'd love to learn more about the arowana. But with archerfish, there is this the process by which not only do they aim for these distal targets, they are monitoring conspecifics that might get to the target before they. So it's pretty sophisticated, absolutely. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure what is going on in terms of, are they imagining possibilities and deciding to pick one? It seems like they probably are. It is seemingly fairly restricted, though. There's not a lot of cases of fish doing this. So maybe it's a special adaptation. Teleosts, I should say, are very, very different from the fish I've been talking about. So teleosts are modern fishes. They've had as long to make more complicated sort of adaptations as land animals have. They split off from other fish roughly similar amounts of time ago. And so it's very possible in certain groups of fish that adaptations to do planning, like what we see, something similar to what we see in archerfish, has occurred there. With gars and sturgeon and other such fish that are more representative of the ancestral condition, I'm not aware of work indicating anything like planning. And I would put that at the doorstep of sensory physics. In the case of archerfish, it's very interesting that they have a tiny bit of fluid to go through. They usually hunt just a bit below the surface, and then the rest is aerial vision. And they've accommodated optics to do that calculation because there's a difference in refractive range. So most of what they're seeing through is much more transparent. So this is a situation where sensory physics, my argument would actually say, that's kind of a midway case where there's enough sensory range to give you non-reactive behaviors, which we see very clearly in the archerfish. So arowana, I don't know their hunting strategy. I need to learn more, so I'd love to talk to you more about that. Yeah.
You've focused on vision. What about olfaction? Does that give
Right.
the fish a greater range?
So sensory ecology differs greatly across modalities in terms of how well the sensory energy directs the animal. So think about trying to plan over a set of intermediate obstacles for a distant odor source. It's very hard to. You don't smell obstacles. You don't smell the barriers. So you can't really plan over them. What you can do, and very directly leads to reactive behaviors in the sense of stimulus response, is odor increasing in this direction, odor decreasing in that direction. So go in that direction. So it supports very simple stimulus response sorts of activities. And the same is true of sound, unfortunately. So if you have a distant sound source, you cannot see with that sound source, or you cannot hear with that sound source, all the barriers and the disposition of that sound source from far away. What you can do is you can do more intense that way, less intense that way. Sonar is the one exception, which was only invented by or evolved by mammals, which gives you high enough frequencies of sound production to use it as an imaging system. So then you can use sound production to actually essentially get the same data that vision gives you. And the one animal that can do long-range sensing in water is dolphins and whales, which are land animals that return to the water and have done the one trick you can do, which is use sound as an imaging modality, because mammals evolved high-frequency sound production and reception. So that's kind of an interesting case. And sure enough, with dolphins and other animals that use sonar underwater, their brains have not relaxed back to smaller sizes. They still have big hippocampi and frontal lobes, etc. And they hunt from hundreds of meters, which is, in water terms, just amazing. You cannot get hundreds of meters any other way for an imaging system.
Hi, my name is Etienne. This was a very nice presentation.
Thank you.
Do you think that the fact that the slow learner, the individual who are often shy and more flexible, and the fact that fast learner, the individual that are often more aggressive and more impulsive, this fact have to do with the difference in sensory volume between slow learner and fast learner? The fact that fast learner are less flexible and slow learner are often more flexible.
Oh, so slow and fast learners being, are you referring to the model-free versus model-based learning systems, or are you referring to just humans that can learn quickly versus slowly, or?
Like personality trait between individual. In behavioral ecology, often we measure the time need for an individual to acquire knowledge, or I don't know how to say. It's not a thing about model based or
It's the amount of time for the animal to learn something, like how to forage for something.
Yeah.
And you can group animals into slow versus fast.
Yeah, and often slow learner are better to reverse learning than fast learner. So I wasn't sure if
that's interesting. I need to learn more about that. I don't quite know how to interpret that information in this frame.
It's a curious thing, and maybe I thought that with your model.
Yeah, I would like to learn more about that categorization for sure. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Frederick, by the way. If I understood correctly, your study shows that when the big black square comes more slowly, there will be variability in the response of the fish.
Yes.
So my question is, what is the place of imagination or planning um, without a good a long sensory range? And I know it's kind of similar to what already has been asked, but I really wonder uh, if if there is a place for such a thing, if we can show that there is variability in the response in the behavior, if we slow down what's happening.
Right. So what the fish data showed was that there's a very specialized circuit that gives you super fast but inflexible responses that are easily hacked by a predator. With slightly slower stimuli, the animal opts more in a probabilistic way, more commonly opts to not use the very, very fast circuit, use a slower circuit that burns up 300 milliseconds of time. So if the predator is really rapidly approaching, you're toast. But if you have that much time, you generate a slightly more variable response, which is harder to predict. All right, so there's this trade-off between uh, the sort of time delay and the flexibility of the response. I'm pretty sure that's going to be a continuum, right? I'm showing 2 points on a continuum, and as you go further out, you get, as you have longer and longer distance or time before your interaction with the world, that potentially is time you can use to think. The question is, why would you evolve complex, big, metabolically expensive circuits to do thinking? And I would argue, with respect to predator-prey contacts, at least in water, there isn't much selective advantage. And the Markov decision process modeling of the open world with no obstacles showed that there's no benefit to planning with short sensing ranges. No benefit at all. As you get further out, there's slight benefit. And then as you get further and further out, you get a bit more benefit. It's modest across the whole span of ranges, the increase with planning depth. Where you really get big improvements in the efficacy of planning is when there are obstacles in the world, which you can then use almost like tools. And you then start to think about we hypothesize that you imagine use of those tools, those obstacles, in your strategy. And we're only modeling the prey strategy here, but of course the predator is also sort of thinking about, if I go behind that obstacle, then the prey can't see me, and then, oh, it's moving that way, and its eyes are pointing that direction, so I'm going to move over there, right? So the same thing's happening in their brain as is happening in the prey's. Point is that with obstacles, with complexity of the world, there's a huge advantage then to planning and replanning. And I would claim that the model-free approach of propagating back reward values runs into a lot of difficulty because there's just so many different possibilities that it's hard to use that system. But
Thank you.
thank you for the question.
Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation, or an eye-opening presentation, if I can say.
Thanks.
My name is Mireille Goulet. I just had a question. As you mentioned that invertebrates beat us to land by going on to land 50 million years ago before. Was there a same correlation done with respect to invertebrates as to differences in pupils and so on?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the eyes of invertebrates have a whole different set of constraints. You can't just, so you can double the number of ommatidia, you won't necessarily get better acuity, right? So the acuity of invertebrate eyes in general, although there's some really interesting exceptions, dragonflies have good acuity, bumblebees do, and so do jumping spiders. So there's 3 animals in the invertebrate kingdom which have unusually high acuity. And they also, by the way, those same 3, well, in the case of dragonfly and Portia, the jumping spider, the well-documented stalking strategies. It seems to be hard for invertebrates to get there. There's not very many that do. They mostly have quite low acuity systems for reasons I don't fully understand. But Portia and dragonflies have high acuity, still quite a bit lower than vertebrates, by the way. Most vertebrates, not all vertebrates. Some matches some of the vertebrates for sure. But those eyes under evolutionary pressure don't have a simple way to, like, so for the vertebrate plan, what you do for increased resolution is you increase the density of photoreceptors on your retina. It's a pretty simple, seemingly simple thing to evolve. For better range, you increase your aperture, so you get a bigger eye, bigger pupil. For invertebrates, this ommatidia thing really enforces a certain coarseness or granularity division, which there are tricks that they can do, but the physics of that seem to prevent invertebrates from getting to high acuity vision easily, at least. But it's a great question. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello,
Hi.
thank you for the presentation. My question is, do you think that sentience is related to the development, the complexity of the reactive mode? Because if we do, then that means that the more we're able to generate, reactions, the more we're able to be sentient. And if that's so, I'm confused to see how, let's say there's the mantis shrimp, whose acuity is pretty high compared to other.
Yep.
Okay. How can we be sure that mantis shrimp is as sentient as another living being that's
Right.
able to see, has high acuity, and not as much as we do as human beings, because the mantis shrimp has more than us? But how can we be sure that he's more sentient than we are?
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a super tough question. I was very careful in the title of my talk to talk about the change in sentience with transition onto land, because it's very hard to know what the units of sentience or feeling might be. There are, I take your point that the more reflexive loops you have, the more ways in which you can feel. That makes sense to me.
Right.
And certainly animals differ in the number of reactive loops they have. My point was simply that once you escape reactivity, which I claim is really pushed by sensory physics, then a whole domain of feeling arises, that being the imagination, essentially. So it's the feeling difference between going down a foggy road rapidly and going down a road and thinking about what you're going to do in the future. That's that feeling difference. That's what I'm trying to hone in on. But I take your point, and I don't really know how to answer. Sorry.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.